more rhetorical, and then I'm going to bring Lewis into the conversation.
Okay.
Okay. When can someone call themselves a Christian? There's an idea that I'll get into in a bit about unintentional Christians or unaware Christians, or Lewis used the phrase secretly influenced Christians. What does it mean to be a Christian? Can someone be a Christian without ever knowing it? This side of the grave. Maybe I'll tack that onto the end of it. Is it possible for Christ to flow through non-Christians and for them to participate with Christ without knowing it as participation with Christ? Can Christ know someone, and I mean fully know them, both their elephant and their rider, without someone who is only in their head and in their rider knowing Christ? So only knowing in a rider sense versus an elephant sense. Can Christ, the more important question to me is, can Christ know them fully without them knowing Christ in the headway? So those are some primer questions. All right, here's C.S. Lewis in my read through of everything that I have. I came across this in God in the Dock. He's answering questions for some factory workers. I think it's around 1944. Quick little trivia. It's apparently in the factory that made like equipment used in the music studio where the Beatles recorded Abbey Road. I haven't confirmed this, but I read that somewhere when I was researching this particular Q&A session that he was doing. It's called Answers to Questions on Christianity. He got a question, will you please say how you would define a practicing Christian? Are there any other varieties besides a practicing one? Lewis says, certainly there are a great many other varieties. It depends, of course, on what you mean by practicing Christian. If you mean one who has practiced Christianity in every respect, at every moment of his life, then there is only one on record, Christ himself. That sounds familiar. In that sense, there are no practicing Christians, but only Christians who, in varying degrees, try to practice it and fail in varying degrees and then start again. A perfect practice of Christianity would, of course, consist in a perfect imitation of the life of Christ. I mean, insofar as it is applicable in one's own particular circumstances, not in an idiotic sense. It doesn't mean that every Christian should grow a beard or be a bachelor or become a traveling preacher. It means that every single act and feeling, every experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant, must be referred to God. It means looking at everything, chaos and order, everything as something that comes from him, and always looking to him and asking his will first and saying, how would he wish me to deal with this? So there's some Lewis fun. And then I'm adding this part in, is intentionally cooperating with God in action while remaining agnostic about the physical resurrection or not being able to accept the physical resurrection due to the lenses built into you by your culture, your family, your ancestors, your environment, and all, good enough. Good enough for what? Good enough for God? What is good enough for God? What is acceptable to God? And then here's where I go next, so bear with me. I want to read you a blog post that I did 15 years ago when I was reading Lewis, and I was really struggling with a lot of this. So this is an excerpt from Mere Christianity, and this is what Job said, the blog post that I read to him when we were down in Austin, and he referenced it in our four-way conversation. Lewis says, the world does not consist of 100% Christians and 100% non-Christians. There are people, a great many of them, who are slowly ceasing to be Christians, but who still call themselves by that name. Some of them are clergymen. There are other people who are slowly becoming Christians, though they do not yet call themselves so. There are people who do not accept the full Christian doctrine about Christ, but who are so strongly attracted by him that they are his in a much deeper sense than they themselves understand. There are people in other religions who are being led by God's secret influence to concentrate on those parts of their religion which are in agreement with Christianity, and who thus belong to Christ without knowing it. For example, a Buddhist of goodwill may be led to concentrate more and more on the Buddhist teaching about mercy, and to leave in the background, though he might still say he believed, the Buddhist teaching on certain other points. Many of the good pagans, and maybe he's thinking of Plato here, long before Christ's birth, may have been in this position. And always, of course, there are a great many people who are just confused in mind and have a lot of inconsistent beliefs, all jumbled up together. So I would say a little over 15 and a half years ago, this isn't Lewis, this is me now, I was questioning a lot of beliefs that I had. I wasn't questioning my faith in God, or that there was a God, or even that Christ is who the Gospels say he said he was. I was, however, struggling with church, with pastors' sermons, with strenuous arguments about what the speaker considered, quote, essential Christian doctrine. I was hearing blatant contradictions between pastors of the same denominations. There weren't contradictions about who Christ was or the nature of God. The contradictions were far from what even I considered essential topics of discussion, and I was a mere layman. That's one of the reasons why when one pastor in particular claimed without any doubt that one specific view on what he called the end times was, quote, clearly stated in the Bible, I was thrown for a loop. If it is not an essential doctrine, I thought, why not just say this is a particular view that different Christians have differed on for a long time and still do, instead of glibly saying that it is clearly spelled out in Scripture. I let that get to me. I stopped going to church, and I took a little spiritual vacation. It was time to kick back and relax from all the stress. Now, what I call a vacation was actually me foregoing any concern for the spiritual aspects of my life. During this time, I still had an interest in finding out some different Christian viewpoints than the ones I'd been raised in, but I was not interested in just throwing myself back into a church still saddled with the questions and frustrations that had developed in me. When visiting a friend out of town, he gave me the book, A New Kind of Christian, by Brian D. McLaren. Some of the things in there pissed me off, and some of the things in the book scared me. As I kept reading, I could feel the parts of me that were taught to think a certain way about Christianity and the practice of it through what I knew about church screaming out in protest. On my flight home from the visit, I came across a passage in the book which brought me to tears. And there I sat alone on my row, flying from Minneapolis to Dallas, sobbing. I couldn't understand why it impacted me the way it did, so I didn't feel like I knew how to even express it if I were to talk to anybody about it. I think I better understand now why it hit me the way it did. And I've since misplaced the McLaren book, but by good fortune, the passage that was actually hitting me was quoting from another author, C.S. Lewis. Surprised? The quote was from the final installment of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle. And towards the end of the story, Aslan, the Christ figure in the Chronicles, is welcoming some of the main characters of the series into the afterlife, into his country, into heaven. An unlikely character named Emeth turns up in Aslan's heaven. Unlikely, it seems, because he spent his life earnestly following and serving a false god in the story named Tash. Here's a passage from The Last Battle, which I do have in my possession, where Emeth comes to the undeniable realization that Tash is a false god because he is personally greeted by Aslan. And here, Paul, I know you know this story, but I just want to share this excerpt with everybody. Emeth recounting his story, he says, "But the glorious one," talking about Aslan, "bent down his golden head and touched my forehead with his tongue, and he said, 'Son, thou art welcome.' But I said, 'Alas, Lord, I am no son of thine, but the servant of Tash.' He answered, 'Child, All the service thou hast done to Tash, I account as service done to me. Then by reason of my great desire for wisdom and understanding, I overcame my fear and questioned the glorious one and said, Lord, is it then true, as the ape said, that thou and Tash are one? The lion growled so that the earth shook, but his wrath was not against me. And he said, it is false, not because he and I are one, but because we are opposites. I take to me the services which thou hast done for him, for I and he are of such different kinds that no service which is vile can be done to me, and none which is not vile can be done to him. Therefore, if any man swear by Tash and keep his oath, for the oath's sake, it is by me that he has truly sworn, though he know it not. And it is I who reward him. And if any man do a cruelty in my name, then though he says the name Aslan, it is Tash, whom he serves, and by Tash his deed is accepted. Dost thou understand, child? I said, Lord, thou knowest how much I understand. But I said also, for the truth constrained me. Yet I have been seeking Tash all my days. Beloved, said the glorious one, unless thy desire had been for me, thou wouldst not have sought so long and so truly. For all find what they truly seek. The reason that this excerpt pierced me the way it did is because it presented God the way I had always hoped deep in my heart he would be. And yes, I know it's just a story, but the character I recognized in the story was the same person, capital P, I recognized as the ruler of my heart. As poor and disobedient a subject as I am, this, I think, is the first time I personally experienced what Tolkien calls a eucatastrophe. He defines it as, quote, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. He goes on to explain that a eucatastrophe has the effect it does because it, quote, is a sudden glimpse of truth. And, quote, it perceives that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world, capital G, capital W, for which our nature is made. I felt overjoyed at the possibility that this is how God practices his judgment with non-Christians. It added a level of fairness and justice to the whole Christian idea relating to those that are not confessed believers in Christ. I like the idea of a secret influence, God's influence, that was echoed in this Lewis passage. It satisfies my longing for an expectation of justice that I know is in the character of the God I serve.